Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm your host, Park Howell, and author of Brand Bewitchery, the one book that takes you by the hand through the story cycle system to craft and tell compelling stories in your branding, in your business, and with your sales team. So grab your copy now on Amazon or Apple Books. But you know what? It's not enough just to share a good story. You actually have to make it accessible for your audiences. And that is exactly what we are exploring today with Neil Nelson, the founder of Atlanta Blackstar, one of the premier digital media companies for African Americans, where access to accurate business information, networks, and financing is success for their millions of followers. And as you'll hear, Neil is an absolute expert at making their storytelling accessible to their audiences, to their readers, to their viewers, to their clients and their customers. I know this because I had the distinct honor of working with Neil and his team starting last August in helping them refine the Atlanta Blackstar brand story. And I was so impressed with the impact that they are making in the world that I invited him here today to share his unique approach to storytelling with you.
We were making stories more accessible, and not just contemporary stories, but also historical stories. We were going back and looking at African history and Black history broadly and saying, what stories from the past that have been hidden or concealed, intentionally or unintentionally, that we can then go back and retrieve them. There's a terminology, a concept in West Africa, in what is now Ghana, called Sankofa, which is represented by a bird looking backwards with its head turned towards its tail. And the idea is that before you take off to move into the future, you must first look back. And so in that spirit of Sankofa, we were going back and accessing, retrieving stories that were then more available to the contemporary population.
Neil is a successful entrepreneur who co-founded and developed several digital media properties and web products using search engine optimization, social network marketing, and accessible storytelling. He used SEO and content aggregation to grow dimewars.com to nearly 30 million unique visitors in under 2 years. He developed an agency to help brands function like publishers and, for instance, helped AT&T connect with hard-to-reach consumer segments. And, of course, he founded Atlanta Blackstar and has grown it in under 3 years to be one of the largest digital media properties for African Americans. So now you can learn how to make your brand, business, and sales storytelling even more accessible to your audiences today with Neil Nelson. Neil, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here, Park.
Last year was a crazy year for everybody, to say the least. But one of the real blessings that I got was a chance to work with you and your team over there at Diaspora Media. And we did a lot of fun things together, worked on storytelling and worked on some of your brand storytelling. And I was just absolutely honored to work with you all, given the great impact that you're having out there in the world. So I appreciate you being here today. How is 2021 kicking off for you?
2021 we're still figuring it out. We're still figuring out the changes that have occurred in 2020 that are still playing themselves out in the first quarter. We are hoping that things will be much better, in the second and third quarter of this year.
Yeah, and much better how for you? Is that in the number of visitors to your website or the impact you're making in the world, or how are you measuring that betterment?
Yeah, I think those are certainly two of our KPIs, and the third KPI for us obviously is revenue. But we start off with the impact that we're making in the world, and then we kind of look at a way to look at that is to look at the traffic and see who's coming back to the website, and then how we're monetizing that traffic.
Tell us a little bit, if you can define what it is exactly you do. You've got these two entities that I'm very well aware of, Atlanta Blackstar and Diaspora Media. Can you kind of explain how those two come together?
Certainly. So Diamond Diaspora Media is the parent company of AtlantaBlackstar.com, which is our primary digital media asset. Digital Atlanta Blackstar and DDM for short, and so we can use DDM and ABS for short for both of those entities. So DDM and ABS were founded 9 years ago. April will be our ninth year anniversary, and we started with the mission of saying, what kind of content gaps were there in the world, and in particular in the Black community in this country and throughout the world, that we could fill with content, with narratives, with the objective of tilting the world in the direction we thought it needed to go. And so, that was the impetus for launching those two brands.
And why? What was it about your background that you felt like you really needed to fill this void out there in media?
So a part of for me, my background is in math and engineering academically. However, the longer story before the math and engineering is I was born in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and grew up with stories, grew up with narratives, and stories have always been an essential part of my identity. I remember I was born in a remote, rural part of Jamaica in the interior, in the parish of Clarendon, and in many ways we were very separated from the rest of the world in that we didn't have running water, we didn't have paved roads, we didn't have electrical systems, we didn't have a television in the home. And so most of my early story, my education, if you will, came through narratives, through storytelling. My grandmother, as the matriarch of our family, would sit us down on the front porch, what we call a veranda in Jamaica, and would tell us stories about, biblical stories, stories about West African folklore, mainly around the character of Anansi, a very famous West African mythological figure, and also stories about the past, about slavery in Jamaica and the world. And so those narratives really informed my thinking about the world as a child. And eventually, when we came to the United States, I continued to look at those three, main story types and delve deeper into them as a teenager and into my 20s and early 30s, and began to say, well, what is it about my particular way of looking at the world that has given me some degree of success more than others, and how can I share that with the world? So that was a part of the kind of the more extended background as to why those two properties came to be.
And how did you find yourself in the States?
In what state in particular are you referring?
Well, in the United States, you came from Jamaica. You went
Oh,
to
yes.
the Georgia Institute of Technology, and you've got degrees in industrial engineering, and
Yes.
so that sounds like it's quite a leap from where you grew
Yes.
up.
Yeah. So, my dad came to the United States as a farm worker. There's a farm worker program that Jamaica has in the United States, where rural poor Jamaicans are allowed to come to the country, like so many other countries in the hemisphere, to work on in tobacco and other uh, farm environments. In particular, my dad came to Florida to cut sugarcane in I guess almost central Florida, and then further north into New England to pick apple and strawberries and things of that nature. And he stayed and got his citizenship, and then he filed for us to come and live with him in New England, Massachusetts. And so I was fortunate to attend middle and high school in Springfield, Massachusetts, and then from there came to Atlanta to study math and engineering.
And was there a time in your life in particular, a moment that you realized that you wanted to get into math and engineering?
Yeah, so for my dad, he had a really rough time as a very, coming from a very poor background and with not many information technology type skills, in the 80s and 90s. And so his only skill that he had was he was a carpenter. And so he told us, all of his children, that the one thing that no one can take away from you, that you can always fall back on, is your knowledge, what you know. And then he spelled out for us what kinds of professions were the ones that were most valuable, and that was being either a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And so I chose engineering.
Well, then you must have had a pretty good schooling, and I know you're very smart, but to be able to get into the Georgia Institute of Technology, how was that transition for you?
It wasn't that bad because, in Jamaica, my mom, even though we didn't have the best school system where I grew up in the rural part of Jamaica, my mom would always read to us every night. And so, in addition to telling this, hearing the stories from my grandmother, my mother would also read. We only had a few books in the home, but she would read them to us, my sister and I, on a regular basis, at least every weekday. And so that my reading abilities, my math skills are pretty strong. I was always on the honor roll throughout middle school and high school, and so that made it quite easy to get into these schools.
So you really know the power of story from having grown up around it with your grandmother and your mother, and how it was essential to your learning early on.
Oh, absolutely. I think that stories really organize consciousness. I think that, and I think, we've always known that. I've known that personally, in reflecting back on my past once I was in my 20s. But, I think humanity has known this truth about itself from time immemorial. I think from the earliest civilization, at least at the beginning of the Bronze Age, we've always known across all human societies that narratives are a fundamental part of organizing a society and organizing individual human consciousness.
So was one of your first jobs out of school working at Home Depot, and you were a global logistics engineer of sorts?
Yeah, that's correct. So my first gig out of college was working at the Home Depot corporate headquarters here in Atlanta, and working global logistics department in the engineering team. And funny story, I actually got that job because the woman who hired me and I, during an interview, we spent half the time talking about stories and talking about the power of what it means to be a Virgo and the whole mythology around birth signs and things of that nature. And because I knew those stories about the mythology around this birth signs, we connected because she also believed in that, and so I kind of got the job within the first half an hour from just talking and being able to relate to her. Interesting story. She also was born in Massachusetts, in Boston, and so she was 2 hours east of where I grew up. And so all of these connected story points made it easy for her to hire me and give me that my first job out of college.
Yeah, it just goes to show how stories can connect two worlds. You didn't know her, she didn't know you. You sit down, start sharing stories, your love of stories. Now you've got me really intrigued. Birth sign. So I take it you're a Virgo.
Yes, I'm a Virgo.
So what does story have to do, or what story mythology is based around Virgo birth sign?
Yeah, so I think the idea of Virgo being the virgin, the purest, in search for ideals that the Virgo person seeks to embody is the mythology that I think I've identified with. And something that, in this example, my first boss, Brooks Roby, if she ever get to listen to this, 20 years ago, connected on. And interestingly, what I think is unique about that story, Park, is that she was a white woman in her 40s, and I was a young black man in my early 20s, 22 at the time. She come from a very upper class background. Her dad is a doctor and all these things. She's married to an affluent businessman here in Atlanta. And, she runs this engineering team, and we're able to connect on something that's universal, right? These stories, there's archetypical stories about the different birth signs that human beings have connected with across cultures for thousands of years, right? And so I think that this is one of the I think the unique power of these universal stories and archetypes is that if you really know them and can connect with them, it's another universal language that people can relate to and quickly form bonds within 25 30 minutes, as we did.
That is fascinating. I've never really studied the birth signs stories. I'm an Aquarius. What do you know
Mm.
off the top of your head what my mythological story is?
Well, I know that Aquarius, obviously, everyone knows is the water sign, and that we're entering into the age of Aquarius, supposedly in the next 10 to 20 years. And the thing that I do know about folks who are Aquarius is that They tend to be more fluid, more able to interact with different types of people and different signs of people than, say, a Virgo. Virgos are our earth signs are very particular about who we interact with and who we connect with. We don't always get along with everyone else, but we do get along with people like Aquarius, like Pisces, who are actually signs that are adjacent to each other, the water and the fish. And that makes complete sense, of course.
Oh, well, maybe that's why you and I got along so famously when we got working together last September. So now I know. That's great.
Indeed, indeed, indeed.
Well, you moved into and became quite an entrepreneur in the digital space. How did you make that transition out of Home Depot into some of the other work you have done to find you where you are today?
Yeah, so I quit my job at the Home Depot because I really felt that my calling was in the area of not so much global logistics, but changing the world in a different way. Certainly, there's room to influence the world through global logistics, working at the second largest retailer in the United States. But I wanted to help change consciousness. I believe that fundamentally, the status quo of Black people in this society and around the world is an unjust status quo, meaning that the relationship that people of African descent have with other people in the world is one that is undesirable because we're not in a position where we can bargain as equals with other people in the society and around the world. And when I studied that problem and the history of that problem, basically how the world came to be, how did we end up in a world where some people, based on their ethnicity or the color of their skin or their hair texture, are able to have more power in the world than other people. And it's a fascinating history that I've really delved in since I was a teenager. And realizing that if I wanted to make the most impact, that publishing stories, being in the content business, would give me the greatest leverage in influencing what the next 20, 30, or 50 years could look like.
And so you co-founded Broken Curve, and was that right after Home Depot? Was that your next step? Was Broken Curve, and what was Broken Curve about?
Yeah, so Broken Curve was a business that I co-founded, my first business out of the Home Depot that I founded with one of my fellow Georgia Tech alums. And, he was in at the time, the IPTV space, which was just brand new space at the time.
What is that?
That's Internet Protocol TV. So it's TV
Okay.
over your internet. So it was called way before, before Netflix and before all these modern, late iterations. And so he was involved in helping to write the code that interface with your hotel room or your cruise ship room, if you're going on the cruise, and the central database or menu system for those spaces, the hotels or the cruise ship, and allow you to order movies or order your dinner and things of that nature. And so being in that space, we saw that there would, this next iteration of where this space would go would be in general consumption across the world, including in your home. And so we tried to head that off by creating a company called Broken Curve that would aggregate globally content from the African diaspora and put it in one central place to be consumed and ad supported. We were ahead of our times by about 4 or 5 years. The advertising ecosystem that has now emerged in the last 10 years was not there to support that. And so that business, we had to pivot, and we pivoted and created a website around news and information in the hip hop music industry space. And that was pretty successful. He and I in our garage were able to generate several $100,000 a year, just the two of us. And 1 year we actually reached $1 million in revenue. And so that was from our point of view, is guys in our late 20s, early 30s. That was really good, a good success story for us. But like most young people at that age, we kind of went our separate ways, and that's when my next venture was birthed.
And that's Diamond Diaspora Media. So you did the Broken Curve from 2006, 2011. So then you kicked on into DDM. And
Correct.
what was your thinking there? Now, from everything you had learned leading up to this, what was your impetus for creating DDM?
Well, I wanted to do something that was different in the sense that I didn't want it to be around hip hop music and culture, because that was more so a pivot reactionary thing, like, oh, we're already in this space. This is where the industry is going. Let's just do that, and to leverage what we're already doing. But I wanted to make sure that what we were doing in DDM was more in line with what I think the values and ideas um, of the content that we were publishing should go. And so this go around with the DDM project, we reached out to people that were in some ways connected to either the marketing dollars or the media space, who had that experience to help us build something that was of a higher caliber than what we had done with the Broken Curve property.
So it was the same type of delivery system where you were using this internet protocol TV to be able to deliver your media, but were you expanding then your content and the subject matter that you were sharing?
Yeah, we shift the content to target people who were more professional, people who had gone to college with, and were more interested in social issues surrounding wealth building, political issues that are of interest to the overall Black community. Whereas the hip hop piece was definitely geared towards young Black men in their 20s and late teens. We wanted to pivot in a more mature part of the community, as we ourselves, were significantly more mature and had lost touch with that audience and the taste and the content consumption patterns that were common in that space. We didn't focus initially on IPTV for the first couple of years. We focused mostly actually on articles, writing articles. It wasn't until actually about the third or so year that we went back into doing the kind of video delivery that we were doing on the previous project.
And the goal of DDM then is basically an online magazine, for lack of a better term, and correct me if I'm wrong there, but it was to be able to cover issues facing Black community. And to what end? I mean, is the business model such that you grow a readership, a viewership, and then sell advertising within that? Or how did that all work out?
Yeah, so DDM as the parent company, we see that as ultimately being able to do media in really in any number of ways. ABS in particular is a news magazine platform that targets, again, the African American community. We see most of our audience are in their mid to late 20s up until their late 40s. And the way that we drive traffic through the typical channels that most people are familiar with: Facebook, Google, Twitter, and newsletters and the like. And we monetize that through the advertising uh, placed on the pages, primarily through the new ecosystem, which is through what's called programmatic advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And when you said ABS, you mean Atlanta Blackstar.
that's
Just
correct.
just just to be clear on that. So in all of these endeavors, and I know it's going quite well for you now, I believe,
Yes.
how have you used and leveraged your storytelling from a very young age in each one of these endeavors to help keep you ahead of the pack and being really one of the thought leaders out there now in this area?
Yeah, it's really going back to this idea of identity in many ways, right? What is it that makes us able to even communicate, you and I, is the fact that we're both native English speakers with different accents, of course, and that at a very broad level allows us to communicate. But there are many more components for identity that people connect on and naturally rally around, right? If I went into a room and there were people speaking several different languages, I would naturally gravitate towards the person speaking English. Well, it's the same thing for any other form of content attribute, whether it's talking about political issues, social issues, business, or sports. Folks are naturally going to gravitate towards content that speaks to some component of their identity. And that's something that I've known, just because, again, growing up in an environment where we were telling these stories, and we were referencing these stories over and over again as a child, as a teenager. I know that I'm interested more in stories that reaffirm those parts of my identity, especially if they're not being verified or being reaffirmed by the mainstream uh, media sources that are out there. So we do well in the kind of content that news content that the major CNN or Fox typically either don't cover often enough, or don't cover in depth enough. And so we do a significant amount of our work in focusing on bringing those deep, nuanced stories to the surface, and in many cases we're able to elevate them in consciousness, in the public consciousness, enough for the mainstream media to pick them up. uh, and I think our audience come to us for that, and they've come to love us for that as well.
So essentially, like every great entrepreneur, you are filling the void of content as Afro Americans, people of color are underrepresented in traditional standard news coverage. So you are all are coming in through Atlanta Blackstar and Diamond Diaspora Media to really dive deep into these stories and bring these truths to light. And in doing so, you are building this viewership, this listenership, readership that can identify with that, at the same time elevating those stories into the more, white culture, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, the black community in this country have often felt that their point of views and their stories have not been properly represented, or at least, and when they are told occasionally, it's on and off. It's not a consistent part of the narrative fabric of the society. And so having black media becomes essential in serving that need and helping to fill that gap. And we're not the first to do this. This goes back at least over 100 years. There have been innovative trailblazers who have kind of set the tone for what that has looked like in the past. I think what we have today, at least folks like us, we have better technology that grants us unapproved, unsanctioned access than we had previously. 30 years ago, we would need to have had raised a lot more money to do what we do, perhaps getting permission or access from certain people that are gatekeepers in the mainstream culture and in the black community. Not in this day, we're able to bypass all the gatekeepers and go straight out into public square with our message and our voice and our point of view. And that's the brilliant thing, and the wonderful thing about the technology that has come online in the last 20 years in general, but in particular in the last 10 years, is that anyone with a very committed passion for a particular point of view can come to the public square. And of course, that comes with both cost and benefit. But I think it's better that we have that opportunity than not.
Yeah, absolutely. With your background in storytelling and these really great media companies that you have created, why was it then that you came to me in business of story to work with storytelling with your team? Because it seems like it's already so well embedded in what you're doing.
I think it's because I fundamentally believe that people can do that. We can always do better. There's an ancient saying that comes from ancient Egypt that says that the limits of learning are never attained. And even though we have a significant understanding of this topic and the power, there's still more to be learned, and different point of views to be learned. And I think that's what I knew, and then that's what we experienced with working with you, is that even if you think you have mastered this topic of narratives and the power of stories and the business of storytelling, I'm quite certain that you can learn more by talking to someone whose exclusive business is studying the impact and strategies of utilizing stories.
You're preaching to the choir here, Neil, because in my line of work, I have read, I don't know, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of books on storytelling. And I got to the point of thinking, I can't crack another one of these books because I'm reading the same things over and over again in just kind of a different way. And then I got referred to it. So I didn't read one. I didn't read one on storytelling maybe the last year and a half. I would, glance through them. And that's a trap because now it's the curse of the expert and you don't really see, other ways of teaching it. I was referred to a book called The Science of Storytelling by Will Shore. And it is a marvelous book. And it is one of the best of all the books on storytelling that I've read. I know you're a big reader. So if you want a good book, pick up Will Shore's The Science of Storytelling. A gentleman by the name of Matthew Woodgett, who was on my show a couple weeks ago, referred the book to me. And I'm so glad he did. And in fact, just heard today that I'm going to have Will Shore on the show in a couple of weeks. So I'll be interested in speaking with him. But I was the same way. I kind of got to the point of I've been so deeply involved in storytelling, business brand, sales storytelling that, do I really need to read another book? And yet there's always more information that you can digest and really get your head around. So we had a great time working together over the course of several weeks with your team.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think, I'm just curious, how do you think it impacted how you are telling your stories now than what you were doing before?
So I think there's two significant ways that I think come to mind immediately. One is that the ABT structure that you introduced us to is one that makes it very easy for us to put together even impromptu speeches or statements or emails, any kind of communication. Right away, we know where to start, right? We know exactly where to start. There's a structure that can take you into what you want to say, help you frame and think about what you want to communicate. So that's one that's very powerful, and that we talk about and we spread that gospel internally in the organization and also to others in our close networks outside the organization. So that's one. The other way is, helping us to really solidify what it was that we were always talking about, but didn't really concretize it in a phrase or a term. And that is this idea that what we were always doing was dealing with this issue of access. And it was going through this process with you through the workshop that really bubbled to the top after those 5 or 6 conversations, that it was access that we were dealing with all along. And that was the issue of access that people of African descent had been dealing with in this country for the last several hundred years and still dealing with today. And so that has fundamentally reshaped how we talk about our business and its purpose.
And that came down to your brand story. The ABT is very helpful in doing that, but also working with you through it all. And it's that one word, isn't it? It's that theme of access. And you all were talking about it and you were talking all around it. And then we said, nothing in Atlanta Blackstar and Diamond Diaspora Media makes sense except in the light of access. And there are a number of different layers of access and what that means. Would you mind talking about the different kinds of access that you do provide, from everything from the content to the information to the people in the networking?
Certainly. I think that, on the broadest aspect of that is bringing these stories to the public square. So often in this country and around the world, communities like the Black community in this country have an experience that is not perfectly aligned with the mainstream experience. And as a result of that, those experiences are not brought to light, not in a consistent way, as I mentioned before. And what we have done fundamentally, our success is that we have been bringing those stories to the public square to make them accessible to the community itself in a broader way. If something was happening in Orlando, Florida, or in Springfield, Massachusetts, or in somewhere in the Midwest in a small town, we were able to bring those stories to the front of the entire community, to 7.5 million people, and they were able to react to that and share that across the world and make it more accessible, that other people, policymakers, politicians, activists could see those stories, speak to them, and potentially elevate them in consciousness and salience for the broader American public. I think that's fundamentally the core of our business. We were making stories more accessible, and not just contemporary stories, but also historical stories. We were going back and looking at African history and Black history broadly and saying, what stories from the past that have been hidden or concealed, intentionally or unintentionally, that we can then go back and retrieve them. There's a terminology, a concept in West Africa, in what is now Ghana, called Sankofa, which is represented by a bird looking backwards with its head turned towards its tail. And the idea is that before you take off to move into the future, you must first look back. And so, in that spirit of Sankofa, we were going back and accessing, retrieving information, stories that were then more available to the contemporary population. So that's one way in which I think this issue of access and the topic of access was central to what we were doing. Now, as we move forward in building on that, we're aiming to bring people in our audience access to opportunities in business, to wealth, to information about wealth building. We're actually right now in conversation with one of the largest financial news company in the world. We're working out the details of them allowing us to partner with us, rather, to bring relevant wealth building news information and financial news information to our audience in a way that is specific to the needs of this community. That's a form of access. We're looking at how can we then bring these experts behind the content to make them available to the audience that may not have the most direct access to these resources. So what we're seeing is that the fundamental issue, if we're to sum up the issue that Black America has experienced and the African world in the last 4 to 5 centuries, it's an issue of being denied access to their own cultural narratives, denied access to education, denied access to equal funding for housing, for financial support, denied access for opportunities in corporate America, denied access to participate in the global trade and financial networks at scale, and not just here in this country, but all around the world. This is ultimately what we think the issue of our time is, our generation is. It's about access to opportunities on par with other communities. It is no secret, it is no magic why Western Europe and the US and East Asia are the most successful parts of our planet. It's because they have the best access to the trade networks, the financial networks, the informational networks. And so we seek to bring other people of African descent into those networks and to create networks that parallel and intersect and overlap those networks.
Yeah, and so it's not just access to content and information and stories, but the networking that you do. You also have a book club, don't you?
Yes, we have a book club, and a big part of that book club is, again, giving folks access to creating a structure that encouraged people to get access to information that they don't currently have, and then to formulate different types of structures. One of the new group that we've built out of that book club is an investment club. We launched an investment club this year, actually, with the book club members, at least most of them, investing together in the stock market and pulling our resources together to invest. And so growing up these kinds of structures organically out of the experience of sharing content and making content available to people that they would not normally have access to.
And so, what was the overall brand story theme that we landed on?
Our overall brand story theme is that access is success, right?
Access is success.
Yep. Yes, and that you can really have all the conversation that we've just been talking about within the context of that point of view, of that insight, and that's what we've been doing in our organization.
And I remember the moment we landed on that. We had you and your team on a Zoom call, and we were talking through all this, and access kept coming up, and we were sort of dancing around access, and then you said, "Access is success." And
yeah.
do you remember that aha moment that hit everybody on the screen at that moment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the world became a lot clearer at that point. right? It's like having a map that you're following. The analogy that I like is like having a map that you're following, and you're following it very detailed, but you don't see the bigger picture, right? You're not exactly sure where it's going to take you, but you know it's the right map. And then finally, the big picture view is available to you. It's like coming on a mountaintop and being able to see across the valley, across where you're going from this kind of broad eagle's eye view. And I think that's what that moment did for us.
Yeah, it was so awesome. I still remember it, and why I wanted to have you on the show today to talk about all of the fantastic work you're doing out there. So, what's ahead for you all in 2021 and beyond?
I think it's in the spirit of that theme. It's about finding new ways to help our audience gain access to the resources, the opportunities, and the information flow that they have not previously had adequate access to. And that varies for the community and for the audience. Some folks are doing quite well, and so what they need access to is significantly different from what others need access to. I was talking to a VP as a result of our process of what we're going to a VP at UBS Bank, and he was asking me what is it that the Black community needs financially as it relates to information, because he's trying to put together a curriculum for their staff to target the Black community more intentionally. And I said, there isn't one specific wealth definition or wealth journey that makes sense for everyone at the same time. People are at different places in their lives, right? Their personal stories differ. And so for my father, who came to this country as an immigrant, as a farm worker with no high school education, no college education, finally owning a home 25 years later is a monumental financial accomplishment for him, for wealth, right? And so what that information looked like will be distinct for him, and what access looks like will be distinct for him than it is for me, his son, who came to this country at 12 and has, access to the education and so forth, and being able to build a company that generates 8 figures a year. It's a different idea of what wealth looks like for me and what the information that I need and access that I need. And so we are continuing this journey by finding new ways to identify resources, opportunities, and access in general that our community needs, and partnering with those other entities to help bring it to them in a more culturally relevant, specific ways.
Access is success. You've just defined it. Neil, this has been great. How can people learn more about you, or where would you like to send them so that they can read more about the great work you all are doing?
So to read more about what we're doing, I recommend they go to atlantablackstar.com. We publish news and insight every single day. We're expanding our content creation process. They can learn more there. They can find us actually on all our social platforms are available on atlantablackstar.com. So if they go to the website, they'll see our Facebook, our YouTube, our Instagram, and our LinkedIn and Twitter on there as well.
And then my final question for you, given your deep history of storytelling, what encouragement or advice would you share to listeners about the need to use story in growing your business, your enterprise?
Oh, I think it's essential. I think that connecting to people who, customers especially, or even recruiting people who don't necessarily know about you as a small company, we have found that being able to tell stories that connect people is the most important work that you can do. And we thought we had a good understanding of it, a good handling of it, but through working with you, Park, we found that this ABT structure is a real powerful tool. And if folks don't know the ABT structure, I recommend they find a way to learn that sooner than later, because it has really made communication significantly more effective and efficient for us.
Well, that's great to hear, and thank you so much for that. I have Dr. Randy Olson to thank for the ABT. He's the one that first introduced it to me about 8 years ago. He teaches it in the science world, and I saw the power of it and realized immediately how it could be employed in the business world the brand story creation world and really carving it down, your overall brand narrative, to that core element like you did with Access is Success. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity of working with you and your team over there. You opened my eyes on a lot of different areas, and I had just appreciated your openness to bring a guy like me into your world to help with it. So thank you for that.
You're welcome, and thank you for being available. Appreciate it as well.
And thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. Please go over and check out AtlantaBlackstar.com. Their stories are so well done. They are so compelling, and it will open your eyes to some really, really crazy stuff that's happening out there. And a lot of, some opportunity that's happening because of the great work Neil and his team are doing. So check it out. And by all means, share this episode with friends, families, or people that you think would be interested in this particular topic. That's how we help you get access to the great work that they're doing out there. If I can be of service to you, come on over to businessofstory.com. I will provide you with access to tools, tips, techniques, and talent just like Neil that will help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. Please join me next Monday when we'll have another amazing story artist right here for you like Neil. And until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.